We'll cross to London in a moment, where the government has picked a fight with farmers.
Farmers came to Westminster, as you know, to try and persuade the government to ditch its plan to make some farmers pay an inheritance tax of 20% on farms worth over $1 million.
1,975 tractors. 14 major routes into central London disrupted. Public transport delays across 6 boroughs. An estimated £52 million in lost productivity in a single day. This was not a stunt. It wasn't theater, and it wasn't thrown by ideology. It was driven by desperation. By mid-morning, convoys of tractors rolled into the capital from every direction.
Essex, Kent, Lincolnshire, Yorkshire.
Carrying a message farmers say has been ignored for years. They argue they are being squeezed out by government policy, taxed harder as margins collapse, regulated without protection, and treated as expendable by leaders who have never stood in a field or balanced a harvest budget. Today, they decided they had no choice left but to be seen. What stunned Westminster wasn't the tractors, it was the reaction. Crowds didn't panic, they didn't scatter. They filmed, waved, and applauded. Because across Britain, a quiet belief has been hardening into something louder. You can survive without politicians. You cannot survive without farmers. Support poured in from commuters, shopkeepers, parents, and workers who may never touch a plow, but understand one basic truth. If the people who grow the food are pushed past breaking point, everything else collapses behind them. Farmers accuse the government of stripping support while demanding compliance, signing trade deals that undercut domestic production, and taking public money without offering protection in return. This wasn't about overthrowing government. It was about forcing attention. And as tractors surrounded the capital, one question cut through the gridlock louder than any engine. If the people who feed the country feel abandoned, who is this government really serving? If you want clear, unfiltered reporting on moments like this, take a second to like and subscribe. Now, let's break down what led to today.
By late morning, London wasn't gridlocked because of an accident or a security alert. It was deliberately immobilized. Convoys of tractors moved slowly, deliberately, through key arteries feeding the capital, turning roads designed for speed into symbols of resistance. Traffic stalled for miles. Buses idled. Trains ran late. Delivery schedules collapsed. For hours, the rhythm of the city was dictated not by Transport for London or the Home Office, but by farmers who said they had exhausted every quieter option. Police described the operation as unprecedented but controlled. There were no mass arrests, no running battles, no scenes of panic. Instead, officers focused on containment, escorting convoys, protecting junctions, and preventing secondary disruptions. Several senior police sources privately acknowledged that the optics were impossible to ignore. A protest so large it could not be dispersed without triggering a political backlash far greater than the disruption itself. What unfolded on the streets surprised even veteran observers. Office workers leaned out of windows filming. Commuters raised phones instead of fists. Pedestrians applauded as tractors rolled past government buildings. Placards taped to cabs and trailers carried blunt messages. No farmers, no food. You can't eat policy. We feed Britain. Who feeds us? This was not an urban protest demanding abstract reform. It was a rural revolt arriving physically at the seat of power, forcing a city-centered political class to confront the people who operate far outside Westminster's daily bubble. Farmers involved in the protest said years of mounting pressure had led to this moment. Rising fuel costs, shrinking subsidies, tighter environmental regulations without compensation, and trade agreements they claim undercut British produce while exposing them to global price shocks they cannot absorb. Several described recent government consultations as box-ticking exercises, meetings where outcomes appeared pre-decided, and frontline voices were acknowledged politely and then ignored. What made today different was not the list of grievances. Those have been circulating for years. It was the scale and the confidence. By early afternoon, it was clear this was no fringe mobilization. Support messages flooded social media. Videos of tractors entering London were shared hundreds of thousands of times within hours, often accompanied by comments from people who had never followed agricultural policy before. Many framed it less as a farmers' protest and more as a broader indictment of governance. "You can argue politics endlessly," one commuter said on camera, "but you can't argue with food." Inside Westminster, the response was cautious to the point of paralysis. Ministers avoided live interviews. Official statements focused on respecting the right to protest while minimizing disruption, a line that satisfied no one, neither those stuck in traffic nor those driving the tractors. Behind closed doors, government advisors reportedly warned that a heavy-handed response could turn public sympathy decisively against the administration. This was not a group easily dismissed as extremists or agitators. These were producers, suppliers, employers, people woven directly into the country's survival infrastructure. As the day wore on, the symbolism became impossible to miss. While political debates often unfold in studios and chambers, today's confrontation happened in steel, diesel, and mud-streaked tires on marble streets. It reframed the question not as who is loudest, but as who is essential. And by freezing the capital without violence, without chaos, and without apology, Britain's farmers delivered a message that lingered long after engines shut off. They were no longer asking to be heard, they were insisting. What happens next will determine whether this was a one-day disruption, or the opening move in a much deeper confrontation between those who govern Britain and those who quite literally keep it fed. As tractors held their positions and London remained partially paralyzed, the political response exposed a deeper problem than traffic disruption. Silence. For hours, there was no direct address from Downing Street. No emergency statement, no senior minister dispatched to meet the protest leaders in person. Instead, officials relied on background briefings and carefully worded lines stressing that dialogue would continue through appropriate channels. For many watching, that phrase landed like an insult. Farmers involved in the protest say those channels have existed for years and have led nowhere. Consultations without outcomes, reviews without reversals, promises without protection. Today's mobilization was born from the belief that institutional conversation had failed entirely. Inside Westminster, sources describe a government divided on how to respond. Some advisors pushed for rapid concessions, warning that public sympathy was already leaning heavily toward the farmers. Others argued that yielding under pressure would encourage copycat actions from other sectors already under strain. But the core problem was credibility. This was not a protest easily dismissed as ideological or partisan. It cut across traditional political lines. Many farmers involved said they had voted Conservative, Labour, and everything in between over the years. Their frustration was not about party loyalty, it was about survival. What unsettled ministers most was the public reaction. Polling conducted during the disruption showed majority support for the protest, despite the economic cost. Interviews with commuters revealed irritation, yes, but also understanding. The dominant sentiment was not anger at farmers, but resentment toward a political system seen as distant, technocratic, and insulated from real-world consequences. Several Londoners interviewed asked the same blunt question: if farmers can't afford to farm, what exactly are we protecting? The narrative had shifted. This was no longer about rural subsidies or environmental targets. It had become a referendum on priorities. Food security versus fiscal optics, domestic production versus international trade deals, frontline producers versus policy designers. Government attempts to reframe the protest as disruptive but limited struggled to gain traction as images of applauding crowds and supportive messages continued to circulate. Every hour the tractors remained visible, the symbolism deepened. The accusation at the heart of the protest, that the state takes from farmers while failing to protect them, resonated far beyond agriculture. Shop owners referenced energy costs, hauliers referenced fuel taxes, parents referenced food prices. The tractors became a proxy for wider economic anxiety. By late afternoon, senior figures acknowledged privately that the situation had escalated beyond a single policy dispute. It had become a test of authority, not in terms of force, but legitimacy. And legitimacy, once questioned, is far harder to restore than traffic flow. The government now faces a dilemma it cannot solve with press releases alone. Confront the farmers and risk cementing an image of detachment. Concede too quickly and expose vulnerability. Delay further and watch sympathy harden into expectation. What began as a convoy from the countryside has cornered a leadership already struggling with public trust. And as engines idled outside the corridors of power, one reality settled in across Westminster. This protest worked. Not because it was loud or violent, but because it struck at something fundamental: food, fairness, and the growing sense that those who produce the essentials are being governed by those who do not understand them. Whether the government responds with reform or resistance will shape not just agricultural policy, but the public's belief in who this system is designed to serve. What unsettled Westminster most was not the scale of disruption, nor the images of tractors lining the Capitol. It was the political shape of the protest itself. This was not a movement that could be dismissed as radical, fringe, or ideologically extreme. There were no party banners, no single leader to attack, no slogans that could be weaponized against them. These were farmers, producers, people whose legitimacy does not come from opinion but from output. They grow food, and that fact alone stripped the government of its usual defenses. Inside Whitehall, officials privately admitted this protest was structurally dangerous. Not because it threatened violence, but because it exposed a weakness the government cannot easily patch over: the growing divide between those who manage the country on paper and those who physically keep it functioning. You can ignore activists, you can wait out campaigners, you can demonize protest groups, but you cannot replace farmers. That is the fear. Because the message rolling into London on those tractors wasn't just about fuel costs, subsidies, or regulation. It was about value. Farmers weren't asking for praise. They were asking for recognition that the system has been quietly feeding off them while offering nothing back in return. They pointed to trade deals that undercut domestic production, environmental mandates enforced without compensation, rising input costs combined with falling margins, paperwork replacing protection, promises replacing policy, and the public understood it instantly. That's why this protest didn't fracture public opinion. It unified it. Commuters delayed on buses didn't turn on the farmers. Shop owners locked out of deliveries didn't blame the tractors. Even police on the ground, speaking quietly to reporters, acknowledged the difference between this and previous unrest. One officer summed it up bluntly: "This doesn't feel like a protest against the country. It feels like a protest on behalf of it." That distinction matters, because governments survive crises by controlling narratives, and this time, the narrative slipped out of their hands. Online, the same message repeated across millions of posts. You can live without politicians. You cannot live without food. You can replace ministers. You cannot replace producers. Those ideas don't need organization. They spread on their own. And that's what makes this moment volatile. Officials now fear this protest won't remain isolated, because once one essential sector realizes that visibility works, that public sympathy follows function, others may follow. Logistics workers, hauliers, energy suppliers, those who don't argue ideology, but necessity. That is the nightmare scenario for any administration. Not a riot, not a rebellion, but a quiet alignment between the people who keep the system running and the public who depend on them. Which is why the response so far has been cautious, almost paralyzed. Too much force risks backlash. Too little response looks like weakness. And negotiation, for the first time, happens on terrain the government does not fully control. Because when tractors stop a capital, it isn't just traffic that halts. It's the assumption that power only flows one way. And Westminster felt that shift today, clearly, sharply, and uncomfortably. By the end of today, Westminster hadn't fallen, but something far more important had shifted. For the first time in a long while, the country watched a protest not driven by ideology, but by necessity. Not by slogans, but by survival. And the government didn't know how to answer it, because when the people who feed the nation say they've been pushed too far, that isn't noise. That's a warning. This wasn't about blocking roads, it was about exposing priorities. A government that can find billions for everything except those who produce food. A leadership that talks endlessly about resilience, while quietly draining the very people who make it possible. So here's the question Britain is now asking. And it won't go away tomorrow. If the farmers feel abandoned, who is this government really working for? Tell us what you think in the comments.